On Christmas Day, my own son said, "Mom, we'll come back later," and left her sitting alone at a table set for three. Margaret Whitmore didn't move when the front door closed, didn't call after them, didn't ask when they would return. She simply stood there in the soft glow of the Christmas lights, her hand still resting on the back of the dining chair she had carefully pulled out for her son just minutes earlier, the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon filling a house that suddenly felt too large, too quiet, too empty, as if the warmth she had spent all morning building had slipped out into the cold December air along with Daniel and his wife Ashley, and for a long moment, Margaret simply listened to the silence, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of the wall clock, the quiet settling of a home that had once been filled with laughter but now held only echoes, because this was not how she had imagined Christmas, not this year, not after everything. She had woken up before sunrise, her joints stiff from the winter chill, but her heart light with anticipation, moving slowly but deliberately through the kitchen, measuring flour, stirring gravy, checking the oven temperature twice just to be sure everything would be perfect, because Christmas had always mattered to her, not for the gifts, not for the decorations, but for the feeling of togetherness, the simple act of sitting down at the same table, sharing a meal, being seen, being remembered. And Daniel knew that. He had grown up in this very house, running down these same stairs on Christmas mornings, his small hands tearing into wrapping paper while Margaret and her late husband watched with quiet joy. Those memories were stitched into the walls, into the worn edges of the dining table, into the ornaments hanging carefully on the tree, each one placed with intention, each one carrying a story. And yet tonight, as she slowly lowered herself into her chair, the one across from the empty seat her son had just abandoned, something felt different. Not just the absence, but the weight of it. Because just before Daniel had picked up his coat, just before Ashley had smiled that thin, polite smile that never quite reached her eyes, Margaret had seen something. Something small. Something easy to dismiss if she had not been paying attention. A glance exchanged between them, quick but deliberate, followed by the soft vibration of Ashley's phone lighting up on the kitchen counter. And Margaret had not meant to look. She truly hadn't. But the screen had been facing her. And for a brief second, long enough to register but not long enough to fully understand, she had seen a message, a name she didn't recognize, and a line of text that didn't belong to a quiet Christmas dinner. And she had said nothing. Because Margaret Whitmore had spent a lifetime saying nothing when it mattered most, choosing peace over confrontation, silence over discomfort. But as she sat there now, the untouched plates in front of her, long time, Margaret didn't reach for her phone, didn't turn on the television, didn't try to fill the silence with distraction. She simply sat there, her gaze fixed on the doorway they had walked through, her mind replaying that single moment again and again, the glance, the message, the subtle shift in Daniel's voice when he said they'd be back later. And as the clock ticked forward and the food grew cold, one thought settled quietly but firmly into place. They thought she was alone tonight, but they had no idea what she had already seen. Margaret remained at the table long after the candles had burned halfway down, their wax pooling quietly onto the polished surface she had spent the morning buffing until it shone. And she did not rush to clear the plates or wrap the untouched food, because something inside her had slowed, as if time itself had thickened around her, forcing her to sit with the weight of what had just happened instead of brushing past it the way she always had. And as the clock on the wall ticked past 7, then 8, 9, her mind began to drift not forward, but backward, retracing the quiet patterns of the past 2 years with a clarity she had never allowed herself before. Because loneliness had not arrived suddenly tonight, it had been building, piece by piece, in moments she had once dismissed as coincidence, small disappointments she had softened with excuses, like the Sunday dinners Daniel used to promise but rarely attended, or the holidays that somehow became shorter, rushed between other plans she was never fully included in. And she had told herself he was busy, that work was demanding, that life changed, that this was simply what happened when children grew up and built families of their own. But now, sitting alone in a house that still carried the warmth of a meal no one had eaten, those explanations felt thin, almost rehearsed, like something she had repeated so often she had started to believe it without question. And then there was Ashley, always polite, always composed, Never openly unkind, but distant in a way that was difficult to name. A careful distance that had slowly expanded over time, shaping the space between them into something formal and unfamiliar, as if Margaret were a guest in her own family rather than its foundation, and Margaret had noticed it. Of course she had. The way Ashley would steer conversations, the way she would answer questions meant for Daniel, the way plans would shift at the last minute with gentle apologies that never quite felt accidental. But Margaret had chosen silence, because silence kept the peace. Silence avoided conflict. Silence allowed her to remain close, or at least close enough to believe she still belonged. And yet tonight, as she replayed the moment in the kitchen again, the glow of that phone screen, the unfamiliar name, the quick exchange of looks between her son and his wife, something settled into place with a quiet certainty that was impossible to ignore. This was not new. It had simply been hidden better before. And Margaret felt no surge of anger, no dramatic rush of betrayal, only a steady, almost calm realization that she had been standing on the outside of something for far longer than she had admitted. And that realization did not break her, clarified her, because for the first time, she was not trying to explain their behavior away or protect the image of the family she had worked so hard to hold together. She was simply observing, noticing details she would have once overlooked. The hesitation in Daniel's voice earlier that evening, the way he avoided sitting down right away, the way Ashley had checked the time more than once as if counting down to something else, and Margaret slowly reached for her glass of water, taking a small sip as she looked across the empty chairs, understanding now that tonight had not been an accident or a misunderstanding. It had been a choice, quiet, deliberate choice, and whatever it was they had gone to, wherever they had chosen to be instead of here, it mattered enough for them to leave without hesitation, believing she would accept it the way she always had. But as Margaret finally leaned back in her chair, her eyes resting on the soft lights of the Christmas tree, one thought remained clear and steady in her mind. This time, she would not look away. The house had grown colder by the hour, not in temperature but in presence. The kind of cold that settled into the corners and lingered in the quiet spaces between familiar objects. And Margaret finally stood up, her movements slow but deliberate, as if each step now carried more purpose than it had earlier that evening. She gathered the plates one by one, not hurried, not frustrated, simply methodical, scraping untouched food into the trash with a soft, steady rhythm, the clink of porcelain against the sink echoing gently through the kitchen. And she noticed how different it felt this time, because in the past, moments like this would have been accompanied by a quiet sadness, a need to explain, to soften, to protect the image of a family that still felt whole in her mind. But tonight, there was none of that, only clarity. And as she rinsed the dishes under warm water, her thoughts returned again to that brief flash of light from Ashley's phone, the name she did not recognize, and the message that had been cut off too quickly for her to read in full, but not too quickly for her to understand its tone. It had not been casual. It had not been something you sent when you were on your way back soon. And Margaret dried her hands carefully, turning off the faucet before walking back into the living room, where the Christmas tree still glowed softly in the dim light. And for a moment she simply stood there, looking at it, remembering how Daniel used to insist on placing the star at the very top himself, even when he was too small to reach without standing on a chair. How he would laugh when it tilted slightly to one side, proud of something imperfect but his. And Margaret closed her eyes briefly, not in grief, but in acknowledgement, because that boy no longer existed in the way she had held on to, and perhaps he had not for a long time. And when she opened her eyes again, her gaze shifted toward the hallway, toward the small desk where she kept her reading glasses and her old landline phone, and she walked toward it with quiet intention, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward, because something had changed, not outside, not in the world beyond her front door, but inside her understanding of it. And she reached for her glasses, placing them carefully on her face before sitting down in the chair beside the desk, her back straight, her expression calm, and she picked up her phone, not to call Daniel, not to ask where he was or when he would return, but to scroll, slowly and deliberately, through the few contacts she kept saved, names she had not needed in years but had never deleted, old neighbors, a former colleague of her late husband, And then one name that made her pause just slightly. A family attorney who had helped them years ago when they purchased this house. Someone who understood documents, ownership, details that Margaret had always trusted others to handle. And she did not press the call button. Not yet. Instead, she set the phone back down gently, her fingers resting on the edge of the desk as she thought, because tonight was not about acting quickly. It was about understanding fully. And Margaret Whitmore had always been patient. But now, that patience felt different. Not passive, not yielding, but focused. And as she sat there in the quiet glow of the Christmas lights, one realization settled firmly into place. Whatever Daniel and Ashley had chosen to do tonight, wherever they had gone instead of staying here, it was not something she would confront with questions or emotion. It was something she would meet with knowledge, because she had seen enough to know that there was more beneath the surface, and for the first time, she intended to find all of it. Margaret did not go to bed that night. Instead, she remained in the quiet rhythm of the house, moving slowly from one room to another as if retracing the outline of a life she had built piece by piece over decades, her fingers brushing lightly against familiar surfaces. The edge of the bookshelf Daniel had once tried to climb as a child, the worn armrest of the couch where her husband used to sit every evening with a newspaper folded neatly in his lap, and with each step, memories surfaced not as sharp pains but as soft echoes, moments layered over one another in a way that made the present feel both distant and painfully clear. Because as she stood in the doorway of the hallway, looking toward the closed guest room that had once been Daniel's bedroom, she began to see things differently. Not through the lens of what she had hoped her family was, but through the quiet evidence of what it had become. And she remembered the conversation from 3 months ago, when Daniel had mentioned something casually over the phone about making things easier in the future. His tone light, almost rehearsed, and she had not questioned it at the time, assuming he was talking about his own responsibilities, but now that phrase returned to her with a different weight. And then there was the afternoon Ashley had insisted on helping her organize old paperwork, smiling warmly as she sorted through documents Margaret had not looked at in years, asking gentle questions about property taxes, insurance policies, and the history of the house, questions that had seemed helpful then but now felt deliberate. Carefully placed pieces in a conversation Margaret had not fully understood, and Margaret walked back toward the desk, her steps steady, her breathing calm, because the more she allowed herself to look without filtering, the more the pattern revealed itself. Small actions that once appeared harmless now aligning into something structured, something intentional. And she sat down again, this time reaching for the drawer beneath the desk, pulling it open to reveal neatly stacked folders, each labeled in her careful handwriting, records of bills, documents, letters, all preserved with the quiet discipline she had maintained throughout her life. And she took one folder out, then another, placing them side by side on the desk as she adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning familiar pages with a new kind of attention, not searching for reassurance, but for truth. And she noticed details she had overlooked before, signatures, date, small annotations that marked changes she had trusted without question, because trust had always been her default, her way of keeping things simple, of believing that those closest to her would act in her best interest. But as she turned another page, her fingers pausing briefly over a document she did not immediately recognize, a faint crease forming between her brows, she felt something shift again. Not fear, not even surprise, but a quiet confirmation that her instincts from earlier that evening had not been misplaced. And Margaret did not rush, did not jump to conclusions. She simply continued, methodically, page by page, allowing the information to settle, to form a clearer picture. And as the house remained still around her, the distant hum of the heater the only sound breaking the silence, she understood something with absolute clarity. This was not a single moment of neglect or a thoughtless decision made on a holiday. This was something that had been unfolding quietly, step by step, long before tonight. And whatever Daniel and Ashley believed they were doing without her awareness, they had underestimated one thing. They had assumed she would never look closely enough to see it. Margaret's eyes moved steadily across the document, her expression unchanged, but her mind sharper than it had been in years, because what she was reading was not complicated, not hidden behind confusing language or legal jargon. It was simple in a way that made it more unsettling, a revision, a transfer authorization, a set of updates that had been quietly processed over the past year, each one signed with her name, each one carrying a date she vaguely recognized but had never questioned, and she could almost see it now. The moments when those signatures had been given, small conversations framed as routine, papers presented with calm explanations, Ashley standing nearby with that composed smile, Daniel reassuring her that it was just for convenience, just to make things easier, just to ensure everything would be handled smoothly in the future. And Margaret had believed them, because she had never imagined she needed to protect herself from her own family, and yet here it was, laid out in black and white, a gradual shift in control, subtle enough to go unnoticed unless someone chose to look closely, and Margaret set the paper down gently, aligning it with the others on the desk, her hands steady, her breathing even, because the realization did not overwhelm her. It settled into place with a quiet certainty that left no room for denial, and she leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window where the reflection of the Christmas lights shimmered faintly against the glass. And for a brief moment she allowed herself to think about the version of events Daniel and Ashley must have believed, a version where she remained unaware, where she continued signing whatever was placed in front of her, trusting without question, slowly stepping aside without realizing it. And Margaret almost smiled, not out of amusement, but out of recognition, because she understood now that this had never been about a single decision or a sudden change. It had been a process, patient, calculated, built on the assumption that she would never interrupt it. And as that understanding settled, something within her shifted again, not toward confrontation, not toward anger, but toward clarity, because she did not need to guess anymore. She did not need to wonder what that message on Ashley's phone had meant or why they had left so quickly tonight. She already knew enough to understand the direction of it, and Margaret reached for another folder, opening it with the same calm precision, checking dates, cross-referencing details, confirming what she had begun to suspect, and each page only reinforced what the last had suggested, a pattern that no longer felt accidental. And as the minutes passed, she became aware of how quiet the house remained. No footsteps returning, no sound of a car in the driveway, no call to explain or reassure, just silence. And that silence, once heavy, now felt revealing, because it gave her the space to think without interruption, to see without distraction. And Margaret Whitmore had always been a woman who adapted, who adjusted, who endured. But tonight, as she carefully closed the final folder and rested her hands on top of it, she understood that endurance alone was no longer enough. Not when the foundation beneath her had been quietly shifted. And she glanced once more at the phone resting beside her, her fingers hovering just above it for a brief second before pulling back. Because she did not need to act yet. Not until she had everything in place. Not until she was certain of every detail. And as she stood up slowly, turning off the lamp and leaving only the soft glow of the Christmas tree illuminating the room, one thought remained steady in her mind. They believed they had time. They believed she would continue exactly as she always had. But they had made one mistake. They had not accounted for the moment she would finally decide to look. Margaret woke before the sun rose, not because she had slept well, but because her mind had already moved ahead of the night, organizing, aligning, placing each realization into its proper place with a clarity she had not felt in years. And as she stood in the quiet kitchen, the early morning light just beginning to filter through the curtains, she did not reach for coffee right away. Instead she stood still for a moment, listening again to the silence. But this time it did not feel heavy, felt useful, like space that allowed her to think without interruption. And she turned slowly toward the counter, placing her hands flat against its cool surface as she replayed the sequence of events, not just from the night before, but from the months leading up to it, each detail now sharper, more defined, because once the pattern had been seen, could not be unseen. And she remembered how Daniel had insisted on handling certain payments for her, saying it would save her time, how Ashley had offered to organize everything digitally, so Margaret would not have to worry about paperwork anymore, how small responsibilities had gradually been taken out of her hands, not forcefully, not suddenly, but gently, with reassurance, with smiles, with the language of care that had disguised the shift in control. And Margaret had accepted it, because she had trusted them, because she had believed that family did not require verification, that love did not need to be double-checked. And yet now, as she walked toward the small cabinet where she kept her checkbook, opening it with steady hands, she noticed something she had not paid attention to before. Fewer entries written in her own handwriting, more transactions processed without her direct involvement, and she closed it again slowly, not in confusion, but in understanding, because the pieces were no longer scattered, they were forming a complete picture. And Margaret moved back to the desk, pulling out the same folders from the night before. But this time her approach was different, more focused, more intentional. She was not just reading, she was verifying, comparing dates, matching signatures, noting inconsistencies that once would have seemed insignificant. And as she worked, the morning light grew stronger, casting soft shadows across the papers in front of her. And with each confirmation, her sense of direction became clearer, because this was no longer about suspicion, it was about evidence. And Margaret Whitmore had always been meticulous when it mattered, and now it mattered more than it ever had. And she reached for her phone again, this time without hesitation, scrolling directly to the number she had paused on the night before, her finger hovering for only a brief second before pressing the call button. And as the line began to ring, she did not feel nervous, she did not feel uncertain. She simply waited, her posture straight, her expression calm, because this call was not an emotional reaction. It was a step, a measured, deliberate step toward understanding exactly where she stood. And when the voice on the other end finally answered, familiar but distant from years of disuse, Margaret spoke clearly, her tone steady, asking for a meeting, not urgently, not dramatically, but with quiet certainty. And as she listened to the response, scheduling a time later that week, she glanced once more at the documents spread across her desk, her eyes resting briefly on her own signature repeated across the pages, and for the first time, she did not see it as proof of trust. She saw it as proof of assumption, and assumptions, she now understood, could be corrected. And as she ended the call and placed the phone back down, one thought settled firmly into place. She would not confront Daniel or Ashley yet. She would not reveal what she knew, because knowledge, when used too soon, lost its power. And Margaret had no intention of losing anything else. Margaret arrived 10 minutes early, not out of anxiety but out of habit, the kind of quiet discipline that had shaped most of her life. And she sat in the small office across from the attorney's desk with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight, her expression calm, as if she were there for a routine review rather than something that had quietly redefined the ground beneath her. And when the attorney entered, greeting her with polite familiarity, she did not waste time on pleasantries. She simply placed the documents she had brought onto the desk, aligning them carefully, before sliding them forward, her voice steady as she asked him to walk her through each change, each signature, each transfer, not with urgency, not with accusation, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And as he adjusted his glasses and began to review the pages, Margaret watched him closely, not searching for reassurance, but for confirmation. And it did not take long, because the truth, once examined directly, rarely hid for long. And he pointed out the timeline, the progression of authority, the way access had been gradually expanded, permissions reassigned, responsibilities shifted, all within the bounds of what appeared to be legitimate consent. And Margaret listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her breathing even, absorbing each detail as it was explained, until finally, she asked a single question, simple, precise, whether any of these changes could be reversed. And the attorney paused, considering, before answering carefully, explaining what could be undone, what required additional steps, what depended on timing. And Margaret nodded once, not reacting emotionally, not expressing frustration, only acknowledging the information as she processed it. And then she asked her second question, whether any further actions could be taken without her direct authorization. And this time the answer came more quickly, clear no. And Margaret allowed that answer to settle, because it mattered, not just legally, but strategically. And as the conversation continued, she took note of every option presented, every pathway available, not rushing to choose, but building a complete understanding before moving forward. And when the meeting concluded, she did not linger. She gathered her documents with the same care she had brought them, thanked the attorney politely, and stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, the sky pale and winter quiet, and she stood there for a moment, not to reflect, but to confirm something within herself. Because what she had learned had not shocked her. It had clarified her position, and Margaret Whitmore had always known how to adjust when circumstances changed, but this time, adjustment would not mean acceptance. It would mean action, deliberate, measured, and unseen. And as she walked back to her car, her steps steady on the cold pavement, she reached into her purse and took out her phone, not to call Daniel, not to question Ashley, but to review the next step she had already decided on, because there would be no confrontation yet, no raised voices, no emotional appeals, only preparation. And as she started the engine and pulled out onto the quiet street, one truth remained clear in her mind. They had believed they were guiding the outcome, but they had not realized she had already begun to change it. The days that followed moved with a quiet precision, each one unfolding exactly as Margaret intended. Not rush, not force, but guided by a clarity that shaped even her smallest decisions. And when Daniel finally called, his voice carrying that familiar blend of casual concern and distance, asking if she had been all right on Christmas night, Margaret answered simply, her tone steady, her words measured, telling him she had been fine, that she had enjoyed a quiet evening. And she did not mention the empty chairs. She did not mention the message she had seen, because there was no need to reveal anything yet. And Daniel seemed relieved by her response, his voice softening, moving quickly past the question as if the answer had confirmed something he had hoped for. And Margaret listened, noting the ease in his tone, the absence of hesitation. And when he mentioned stopping by later that week with Ashley, she agreed without pause, her voice calm, welcoming even. And after the call ended, she placed the phone down gently, her expression unchanged, because this was the moment she had been preparing for. Not a confrontation, but an observation. And when the day arrived, Margaret had already arranged everything with quiet intention, the house neat, the documents organized, the atmosphere exactly as it had always been, warm, orderly, familiar, because nothing about her surroundings would suggest that anything had shifted. And when the front door opened and Daniel stepped inside, followed closely by Ashley, Margaret greeted them with the same composed smile she had always worn, her posture relaxed, her movements unhurried, offering them coffee, asking about their week, maintaining the rhythm of normal conversation without a single misstep. And she watched them carefully, not with suspicion, but with attention, noticing the way Ashley's eyes briefly scanned the room, the way Daniel avoided lingering too long in one place, as if both of them were quietly assessing something without saying it aloud. And Margaret allowed the conversation to unfold naturally, giving them space to speak, to fill the silence with updates and casual remarks. And then, at the right moment, she stood up, walking toward the desk where she had neatly arranged a small stack of papers, not the full collection, not everything she had discovered, only what was necessary. And she returned to the table, placing the documents down gently between them, her voice even as she began to speak, not accusing, not emotional, simply stating that she had spent some time reviewing her records and wanted to go over a few details to make sure everything was clear moving forward. And for the first time since they had arrived, the air in the room shifted slightly, subtle but unmistakable, because Daniel's expression tightened just enough to reveal uncertainty, and Ashley's posture changed, her composure still intact but her focus sharper now, more controlled. And Margaret did not rush, she did not press, she simply waited, allowing the silence to settle, giving them the opportunity to respond, because this was not about catching them off guard. It was about showing them that she was no longer where they had left her. And as she looked at them across the table, her hands resting calmly on the surface in front of her, one thing was already clear. Whatever they had expected from this visit, it was not this. Daniel was the first to reach for the papers, his fingers brushing the top sheet with a hesitation he tried to hide, his eyes scanning the lines quickly before slowing, his expression tightening in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. and Ashley leaned slightly forward beside him, her posture still composed but her attention sharpened, her gaze moving across the page with careful precision, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to confirm what Margaret had already understood. And she did not interrupt it. She did not fill it with explanations or soften it with reassurance. She simply watched, her hands resting calmly on the table, her presence steady, because this moment did not require force. It required clarity, and when Daniel finally looked up, his voice came out quieter than before, asking where she had found these documents, the question simple but carrying a weight he could not quite conceal. And Margaret answered without hesitation, her tone even, explaining that she had reviewed her own records, that she had taken the time to understand the changes that had been made, and she paused briefly, not to create tension, but to allow the words to settle, before continuing, stating that she had also spoken with her attorney, that she now had a complete understanding of what had been signed, what had been transferred, and what could be adjusted moving forward. And Ashley's expression remained controlled, but there was a shift, a subtle recalculation behind her eyes, as if she were already considering how to respond, how to regain balance in a situation that had quietly moved beyond her expectations. And Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his hand running once across his jaw, a gesture Margaret recognized from years of watching him think through difficult situations, and she saw it clearly now, not as her son struggling, but as a man realizing that the version of events he had relied on was no longer intact. And Margaret did not press further. She did not accuse or demand. She simply reached forward and turned one of the pages toward them, pointing gently to a section that outlined the most recent change. Her voice calm as she explained that this particular authorization would be reversed, that all future decisions regarding her property and finances would require her direct approval, and that she would be resuming full control effective immediately. And there was no anger in her voice, no viternis, only certainty, and that certainty filled the space more completely than any raised voice could have. And Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, but stopped, his words catching somewhere between explanation and apology. And Ashley remained still, her silence more telling than any argument, because there was nothing left to interpret, nothing left to negotiate in the way they had expected. And Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze steady as she looked at them both, not with disappointment, not with resentment, but with a calm understanding that felt final. And after a brief moment, she spoke again, her voice softer now but no less firm, stating that she had spent many years trusting that things would be handled with care, that she had not questioned because she had believed in the people she was trusting, and she let that sentence rest, without elaboration, without accusation, allowing its meaning to stand on its own. And then she rose from the table, her movements unhurried, gathering the papers with quiet precision, signaling the end of the conversation without needing to say it directly. And as Daniel and Ashley remained seated, processing what had just unfolded, Margaret walked toward the window, her gaze lifting briefly to the soft winter light outside. And in that moment, everything felt different, not because something had been taken from her, but because something had been reclaimed. And as she turned back toward them, her posture straight, her expression composed, one truth remained clear. They had believed she would remain exactly as she had always been, but they had not realized that she had already changed.